The hum of the ship was like a steady heartbeat, the kind that fills the air with a sense of calm, but hides the underlying tension beneath. The USS Aegis cut through the vast Pacific waters, its massive form carrying over 5,000 sailors and officers. The atmosphere on the bridge was electric, yet there was one figure among the crew who went unnoticed, blending effortlessly into the background. Her name was Merritt Aldridge, but at first glance, she could have been any other civilian contractor, silently observing from the sidelines. Her hair was streaked with silver, tied neatly into a bun, and her navy pantsuit, though perfectly tailored, drew no attention. She wasn't the type to command the room, at least not at first. The officers moved past her, busy with their roles. Lieutenant Commander Farrow didn't even spare a glance as he passed on his way to report to the admiral. The analysts gathered nearby discussed trajectory calculations, their eyes sliding past Merritt, ignoring her like she was just another piece of equipment. She didn't mind. Invisibility was something she had perfected over the years. But today was different. Today, things were about to change. Admiral Thorne stood at the center of the bridge, his posture exuding the confidence of someone who had earned every medal on his chest. The sunlight streamed through the reinforced windows, highlighting his uniform and casting a faint glow over the crew members working tirelessly in their positions. Then it happened. Merritt's presence had gone unnoticed for a while, but something in the air shifted. The Admiral's eyes narrowed as he looked across the room. His gaze fell on Merritt, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. His voice sliced through the noise like a blade. "Who authorized a civilian on my bridge?" His words weren't just a question. They were a command. The bridge fell silent, all eyes turning toward Merritt. For a second, no one responded. No one seemed to know who had allowed her in. Merritt closed her notebook slowly, her expression calm, unfazed by the sudden attention. She'd been in worse situations before, disrespected, overlooked, even ridiculed, but today, she knew things were different. "Security," Admiral Thorne ordered sharply. "Escort this woman to the visitor quarters. She has no business here." The crew watched as Merritt stood silently, allowing herself to be led away. The whispers began immediately, murmurs of confusion, judgment, and scorn. Some bureaucrat's assistant. One officer whispered, barely audible, "What was she even doing here?" Another muttered. As Merritt was escorted out, she felt no embarrassment, no shame. This was just part of the game. But she had prepared for this moment. This time, things would be different. Did you enjoy the story? If you're fascinated by stories of strength, hidden power, and unexpected heroes, make sure to subscribe to Requiem of Fear for more exciting and gripping content. And don't forget to comment below with your thoughts. What do you think will happen next? Merritt Aldridge stood quietly at the back of the bridge, her presence almost invisible in the vast command center of the USS Aegis. Despite the bustling activity around her, she moved with a purpose that seemed to go unnoticed by most of the crew. She wasn't supposed to be there, at least not in any prominent way, and she knew it. Her role was to observe, to take notes, and to blend into the background. She had perfected the art of being invisible long ago, and today was no different. She was an enigma to those who passed her by, their gazes skimming over her like she was another piece of equipment in the room. Her navy pantsuit, designed to be functional yet unremarkable, didn't draw attention. Her silver-streaked hair, pulled into a simple bun, was a quiet testament to her age, but it didn't define her. The lines around her eyes hinted at a life lived with purpose and determination, but she wore them without pride. She was neither young nor old. She existed in that space between, where experience shaped her every move but left no room for boasting. She had arrived aboard the Aegis years ago, a civilian contractor assigned to the ship for reasons that no one could quite explain. To the crew, she was just another bureaucrat, a pencil pusher with no real impact on the mission at hand. No one ever asked about her past, and she didn't offer any details about it. The record said she was a defense analyst, but that wasn't the whole story. Merritt's true role, the one that went unspoken, was far more significant and far more dangerous than anyone aboard could imagine. Her position was strategic, hidden in plain sight. No one knew why she had been brought aboard, or who had given her the clearance to stay. She had no official rank, no uniform to wear, and no expectations to meet. She wasn't even a part of the regular crew. In the eyes of the Aegis personnel, she was just another face in the crowd, another bureaucratic decision that no one questioned. And that suited her just fine. Merritt had always preferred to work from the shadows, remaining unnoticed and unremarkable. Invisibility had been her armor for years, allowing her to observe and gather information without anyone realizing her true intentions. She knew that true power wasn't about rank or titles. It was about control, the ability to move through the world unseen, to influence events from the periphery without ever stepping into the spotlight. And Merritt had mastered that art. For the officers on the bridge, she was a mystery. Some of them had worked alongside her for years, yet no one could say they truly knew her. She wasn't like the other civilians who came and went, never staying long enough to become a fixture in the daily operations of the ship. Merritt was different. She had a way of being there without truly being there, a way of blending into the background so seamlessly that even the most observant person would forget she was ever present. Lieutenant Commander Farrow, one of the ship's senior officers, passed by her with barely a glance, his eyes focused on his report as he made his way to Admiral Thorne. Farrow had no time for distractions, and Merritt had long since learned not to be one. The analysts gathered nearby, deep in conversation about the upcoming missile defense drill, didn't even acknowledge her presence. They were too focused on their own calculations and projections to notice the woman who stood just behind them, quietly making notes in her small black notebook. She wasn't even supposed to be there, not officially at least. According to protocol, all civilian observers were supposed to be in the designated viewing area, away from the operations on the bridge. But Merritt was different. She didn't follow the same rules as everyone else. She had her own path, one that was carefully laid out for her long before she stepped onto the ship. Her silence was not one of submission. It was a deliberate choice. In the chaos of the military environment, silence could be a weapon. It was a tool that allowed Merritt to listen, to observe, and to learn. When everyone around her was too busy with their own tasks to notice her, that's when she could truly understand what was happening. She could see the cracks in the system, the tensions between officers, the subtle shifts in power dynamics that others missed. And she used this knowledge to her advantage. Merritt's invisibility wasn't a sign of weakness. It was her strength. It was how she had survived in a world that constantly underestimated her. She had learned early on that in order to gain power, she had to be overlooked. She had to be the person no one noticed, the one whose name was never mentioned in the official reports. She had to be the one who blended into the background, who faded into the shadows until the moment came when she was needed most. But what the crew didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Merritt's position on the Aegis was not just a matter of observation. She had been placed there for a reason that went far beyond any drill or mission. Her true role was classified, top secret, and only a few individuals knew the extent of her authority. Merritt was not just a defense analyst. She was a director of the Shadow Program, a covert operation tasked with overseeing the integrity of the United States' most classified military operations. Her role wasn't about the day-to-day operations of the ship. It wasn't about missile defense drills or tactical analysis. Her mission was far more important: to ensure that no one ever compromised the integrity of the systems and people who kept the nation safe. Merritt Aldridge had been brought aboard to watch over the Aegis, to protect it from within, And though no one knew it yet, today would be the day that everything changed. The tension on the bridge was palpable. The operation was supposed to be straightforward, a high-stakes missile defense drill. But as the minutes ticked by, the unease in the air grew thicker. Merritt could feel it, the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. She knew what it meant, the way the officers moved around the room, the way their eyes flicked nervously toward the admiral. Something wasn't right, and she had been here long enough to know that when things started to unravel, it wasn't just a malfunction, it was a symptom of something deeper. Admiral Thorne was the first to react. He was a man of protocol, a man who believed in the rigid structure of military law and order. His voice carried across the bridge, firm and commanding as usual. "Initiate the launch sequence," he ordered, his hands moving over the controls as his eyes scanned the room, making sure everyone was in position. But as the system engaged, there was an odd stillness. The usual hum of the machinery was replaced by an unnerving silence. Lieutenant Cotry, the communications officer, turned to her console, her fingers flying over the keys. Her brow furrowed as the usual authorization prompts failed to appear on the screen. "Admiral, I'm receiving an error. The authentication codes are being rejected," she said, her voice steady, but betraying the first sign of worry. The room grew tense. The sound of typing became more frantic, as if the system could be willed into submission by sheer force. But Merritt watched in silence, her eyes calculating, observing. The crew around her was beginning to panic. It wasn't just the error. It was the fear that this failure represented. If they couldn't authenticate the system, they would be exposed. A military operation of this magnitude needed flawless execution, and yet here they were, stuck in a digital deadlock. Admiral Thorne's confidence never wavered. "Try emergency protocols," he ordered, his voice a controlled growl. Lieutenant Cotry typed in the emergency override code, her fingers moving faster now. There was a brief moment of hope as the system accepted the code. But then, the screen flashed red again. "Access denied." Came the mechanical voice from the speaker, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Merritt's eyes narrowed. She could feel the situation slipping through the Admiral's fingers. The authority he had so carefully constructed was beginning to crumble, and no one knew what to do next. Not even the Admiral himself. The foreign observers from allied nations, who had been watching the drill with measured interest, exchanged glances. Merritt could see it in their eyes. They were wondering if America's military might had been overstated. Admiral Thorne's demeanor shifted slightly, his eyes flicking to the communication officer as if willing her to do something, anything, to fix the problem. "Try the manual override," he said through gritted teeth. But his tone now carried a hint of desperation. The manual override was supposed to be a fail-safe, the final line of defense when everything else failed. But as Lieutenant Cotry typed the sequence, the system's response was the same. Access denied. A wave of confusion rippled through the room. "What the hell is going on?" Thorne demanded, his voice now sharper, the cracks in his composure becoming evident. At that moment, Merritt stepped forward, though no one had noticed her movement. She walked slowly toward the console, her every step deliberate. The room went silent, eyes following her, unsure of what she intended. The Admiral looked up at her, his expression a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his authority slipping for just a moment. Merritt didn't respond at first. She just reached for the console and began typing with calm precision. The crew watched in confusion as her fingers moved over the keys, her movements slow and deliberate. They didn't understand what she was doing. Only Merritt knew that what they were facing wasn't a system malfunction. It was something far more deliberate. Admiral Thorne's voice came again, this time laced with irritation. "You're not authorized to tamper with the system. Get away from there." But Merritt ignored him, her focus unwavering. She had spent years studying the system's intricacies. She knew it better than anyone in the room, even Thorne. This wasn't a simple glitch. It was an infiltration. Someone had intentionally disabled the system, and they needed to act fast before it was too late. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, entering a sequence of numbers and letters with practiced ease. The tension in the room grew. Thorne's gaze darkened as he watched her work, but he did nothing to stop her. His authority was hanging by a thread, and he knew it. After a long moment, the screen flashed green. The system hummed back to life. The doors to the command center opened, and Commander Lawrence Afer, the ship's executive officer, entered the room. His expression was unreadable as he glanced around the bridge, taking in the situation. He moved toward Merritt, his eyes lingering on her as if seeing her for the first time. "What happened?" Afer asked, his voice steady. Merritt didn't answer immediately. She stepped back from the console, her task complete, and nodded toward the Admiral. "The system was compromised. I've restored control, but you need to identify the breach." Thorne stood frozen, his eyes wide with shock. He had assumed he was in control, that his training, his knowledge, would see him through any crisis. But in this moment, he realized that the true power had always been with someone else. Someone who had been right under his nose, unnoticed until now. The room was silent. For the first time, the crew recognized the depth of the situation. Merritt Aldridge had saved them, and they had never seen it coming. The tension on the bridge was palpable as the system hummed back to life. The crew, still reeling from the failure they had just witnessed, were beginning to realize that something had shifted. What had been a routine exercise, a test of their missile defense capabilities, had turned into something far more serious. And at the center of it all stood Merritt Aldridge, a woman they had dismissed, ignored, and underestimated. For a moment, the room was silent. Even Admiral Thorne, who had once ruled the bridge with unwavering authority, was caught off guard. His gaze was fixed on Merritt, his thoughts racing. How had she done it? What had she known that they hadn't? Lieutenant Cotry, still standing by her console, was the first to break the silence. "The system is back online, sir," she said, her voice tense but steady. "But we've been locked out of the communications grid. There's no way to access external networks. We're isolated." A wave of unease swept over the room. The communication channels, which had been vital for coordinating with Allied forces, were now dead. For a moment, the reality of their situation set in. They were trapped in the middle of the Pacific, surrounded by adversaries, and their mission was compromised. Admiral Thorne's face flushed with anger, his frustration mounting. He had never been one to admit failure, especially not in front of his crew or the foreign observers who were watching from the observation deck. But as he glanced around the bridge, he saw something he had never seen before: a lack of confidence in his leadership. The officers, the very people who had once looked to him for guidance, were now looking to Merritt, as if waiting for her to take the reins. For the first time, Thorne felt the weight of his own inadequacy. He had spent years climbing the ranks, earning every medal on his chest, commanding ships and crews with the precision of a master strategist. But in this moment, none of that mattered. The mission was slipping through his fingers, and he had no idea how to regain control. Merritt, however, stood still, her expression calm and composed. She had anticipated this moment. She had known that the operation would go awry, that the failure of the authentication system wasn't just a glitch. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. But while the others were scrambling, she remained unaffected. She had already taken the steps needed to secure their position. Admiral Thorne turned to her, his voice laced with frustration. "What's your plan, Director? What do we do now?" Merritt didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked over to the command console once more, her steps slow and deliberate. The bridge fell into an uneasy silence as she approached, the crew unsure of what she would do next. With practiced precision, Merritt inputted a series of commands. The screen flickered as the system began to display a series of diagnostic readings. The tension in the room mounted, every person watching her, waiting for her next move. "Shadow protocol," she said, her voice steady. "Activate." At her command, the system hummed again, the once frozen communication grid coming to life. Data streamed across the screen, and the communication lines began to reconnect with external networks. The bridge crew watched in awe as Merritt worked with an ease and familiarity that they couldn't understand. Admiral Thorne, his voice barely audible, spoke again. "What the hell is Shadow Protocol?" His question hung in the air, but Merritt didn't respond immediately. She wasn't there to explain herself to him. She was there to fix the situation. As the system processed the commands, Merritt's eyes scanned the data. Her fingers danced across the keys, inputting commands, reconfiguring security systems, and bypassing failed protocols. In the span of a few minutes, she had turned a potentially catastrophic situation into one they could control. "External communications are re-established," Merritt said, her tone matter-of-fact. "We're back online. I've isolated the breach and locked down the vulnerable points. You can proceed with the operation." The crew stared at her in disbelief. It wasn't just that she had saved them. It was the way she had done it. There was no panic, no second-guessing. Merritt had stepped in and taken control without hesitation, without waiting for approval or questioning authority. For a moment, Admiral Thorne stood in stunned silence, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He had spent his entire career building a reputation as a leader, a man whose authority was unquestioned. Yet here, in front of his own crew, he had been shown up by a civilian who had been dismissed as inconsequential just hours before. As Merritt turned to leave the console, Admiral Thorne stepped forward, his voice tight. "I ordered you off this bridge earlier. You had no business being here." Merritt's gaze met his, calm and unwavering. "You were right, Admiral. I had no business being here." Her lips curled slightly, a faint but knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "But this is why I was brought aboard." Thorne swallowed hard, his expression darkening. He had always prided himself on his leadership. Now, it seemed that his grasp on that leadership was slipping away. Merritt had just demonstrated a level of authority that dwarfed his own, and it was clear that her position on this ship was far more significant than anyone had imagined. For the first time, Thorne felt the weight of his own vulnerability. He wasn't the only one with power on this ship, and in that realization, something shifted inside him. The questions, the doubts, the uncertainty, it all began to settle in. Merritt Aldridge wasn't just a civilian contractor. She was something much more. As he looked at her, the truth began to dawn on him. Merritt Aldridge had been watching, waiting, and when the moment came, she had stepped forward and claimed the power that had always been hers. The air on the bridge had thickened, like a storm was rolling in, and Merritt Aldridge stood at its center, steady as ever. The operation was no longer just a simulation. It had become a live battle, one that tested the very core of their readiness. The crew, who had once disregarded her as an inconsequential observer, now found themselves dependent on her every move. The Admiral, whose confidence had been shattered, looked to Merritt for direction, his eyes betraying a flicker of doubt as he stood behind her. "Director Aldridge," Thorne began, his voice tight, "what exactly do we do now? We're locked out of the entire system, and the communication grid is still unstable. The drill's compromised, and we're exposed." Merritt didn't turn to face him. She simply continued working. Her fingers moved over the keyboard with practiced precision, her focus unwavering despite the mounting pressure. Every keystroke was deliberate, calculated. She wasn't just fixing a malfunction, she was securing their survival. Her mind worked like clockwork, piecing together the chaos before her. "Take a deep breath, Admiral," she said calmly. "The breach is isolated, but I'll need your team to follow my instructions without hesitation. There's no room for error now." For a brief moment, Thorne hesitated. His eyes darted around the bridge, and for the first time, he understood just how deep the situation had gotten. There were people in the room with years of experience, training for moments like this. Yet it was Merritt, an outsider, who held the key to getting them out of the mess they had found themselves in. The crew had already started to adjust to her authority. Lieutenant Commander Farrow, who had earlier mocked her presence, stood at attention now, his eyes flicking from Merritt to the console. "Director," Farrow said, his voice subdued, "we're ready for your orders." Merritt nodded, her calmness radiating throughout the room like a beacon of stability. "Security protocols are restored, but we need to reroute the external communications. The breach was timed with the system's fail-safes to prevent any external signals from escaping. I'll need you to direct the external channels to bypass the firewall." Without waiting for confirmation, she turned to Lieutenant Cotry, who had been at the communications console. "You're going to need to input the override code manually. I've already unlocked the system, but the communication links still require clearance." "We don't have much time." Cotry nodded sharply and, for the first time, looked at Merritt with full respect. "Understood." As the lieutenant worked feverishly to bypass the firewall, Merritt moved to the tactical station. Commander Afer, who had stood silently in the corner, watched her with a growing sense of awe. He had been aware of her technical expertise, but he had never witnessed her command such authority. She was no longer just a quiet observer. She was the leader now, the one who held the threads of this operation in her hands. "Admiral," Merritt spoke again, her voice cutting through the chaos, "we're about to face a full system lockdown. The moment that breach was attempted, they triggered contingency protocols to cover their tracks. That's why the system rejected all commands. But it wasn't just about stopping us. It's a message." "What message?" Thorne's voice was tinged with disbelief, but Merritt didn't answer immediately. Her focus was locked onto the screen in front of her, the tactical display lighting up as she began to reroute data from multiple sources. "I'm unlocking access to the secondary defense grid," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "We need full control, and we need it now." The crew watched as Merritt worked at the console, her fingers moving with a fluidity that came from years of experience. She wasn't just fixing their problems, she was turning the tide. She knew the systems better than anyone on the ship, including Thorne. The Admiral stood silently behind her, his posture now slumped, the weight of the situation finally catching up with him. "Status report," Merritt said firmly, her voice breaking the silence. Her command was unquestionable. Lieutenant Cotry looked up from her console. "We've gained access to the external communications channels. All systems are rerouted to manual operation. We're back in control." Merritt's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, a sign of satisfaction, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She had known it would work. She had prepared for it. The system was responding to her commands now. But it wasn't just the machines that were under her control. She had seized the room's power, transformed the atmosphere from one of chaos to one of calm. Her authority was no longer questioned. She was the one in charge. But just as things seemed to be stabilizing, another message flashed across the screen, a warning. "Director Aldridge," Commander Afer spoke again, his voice edged with tension. "We've detected a secondary breach attempt. It's coming from inside the ship. Someone's trying to access the core systems manually." Merritt's expression hardened. "I knew it." She didn't waste time. She entered a sequence of commands, her fingers moving rapidly, and within moments, the tactical display shifted. "They're using our own protocol against us. They're inside the system, and they're attempting to lock us out for good." The room fell silent. The enormity of what Merritt had just revealed hit them all at once. The breach wasn't just an external threat. It was someone inside the ship, someone who had anticipated their every move. Admiral Thorne's voice was tight. "Can you stop it?" Merritt looked over her shoulder, her eyes locked on his. "I already have." The Admiral's eyes widened as he watched the screen change again. The breach attempt was halted in real time. Merritt's actions were swift and decisive. "We've regained full control of the system, and the intruder has been isolated." The room seemed to exhale collectively. The immediate threat had passed, but the tension remained. Merritt had not only averted disaster, she had exposed the depth of the threat they were facing. Thorne looked at Merritt, his expression unreadable. For the first time, he saw her as she truly was, not just a civilian contractor, but someone with the power to shift the very course of this operation, and perhaps the fate of everyone aboard the Aegis. The bridge of the USS Aegis was eerily quiet now. The hum of the system, which had once been interrupted by the failed protocols and the frantic scramble to restore control, had finally settled into a steady rhythm. The screens blinked green, and the once panic-stricken crew members began to exhale, though the tension that lingered in the air spoke volumes. Admiral Thorne stood at the center of the bridge, his eyes fixed on the status display. For the first time in hours, the ship was operational again. The external communications were restored, the defense grid was resecured, and the foreign observers who had been watching the chaos unfold with interest had started to murmur amongst themselves. They, too, were trying to process what had just happened. How a simple misstep in an otherwise controlled environment had spiraled into a full-scale security crisis. But as the seconds ticked by, it wasn't the system that occupied Thorne's thoughts. It was the woman standing just a few paces away from him, her calm demeanor unchanged despite the storm that had raged moments before. Merritt Aldridge had done what no one else could. She had saved the ship, restored the mission, and ensured that the breach was isolated. Her actions had been precise, deliberate, and effective. There was no fanfare, no applause. She had simply done her job, and done it better than anyone had expected. Yet, what was more striking than the fact that Merritt had neutralized the immediate threat was the realization of how little they had truly known about her. The personnel on the bridge, including Thorne himself, had assumed she was just another faceless bureaucrat with no real stake in the operations of the Aegis. They had dismissed her as someone who simply observed, her presence an afterthought in the daily grind of military procedure. But now, standing in the aftermath of what had just transpired, Thorne understood that Merritt had been far more than a passive observer. She had been watching them. Every decision, every slip-up, every moment of weakness. And when the time came, she had stepped in, using her knowledge and skills to protect them all. Commander Afer, who had remained silent for most of the ordeal, finally spoke up, his voice carrying a tone of reverence. "Director Aldridge," he began, his eyes meeting hers with newfound respect. "We all owe you an apology. You've saved us today." Merritt didn't respond immediately. She stood still, her gaze fixed on the console in front of her, scanning the data. "No need for apologies," she said quietly. "This wasn't about saving anyone. It was about doing my job." Her calm, measured words only served to emphasize the gravity of the situation. She wasn't seeking recognition, nor did she care for it. Merritt Aldridge had made it clear that the only thing that mattered was the mission, no matter who stepped forward to lead it. Her role had never been about glory or visibility. It had been about ensuring the safety of the ship and its crew, regardless of who claimed the credit. Admiral Thorne, who had watched the events unfold from behind her, his authority slipping away with each passing minute, finally stepped forward. His voice was steady now, but there was an undertone of something else, something more human, more vulnerable. "I didn't know who you were, what you were capable of," he said, the words feeling foreign as they left his mouth. "And I should have never underestimated you." Merritt met his gaze for the first time, her eyes cool and collected. Underestimating people is easy when you don't see them for who they truly are. But you're right, it's a mistake. The room was silent, every officer on the bridge absorbing the weight of her words. Merritt wasn't just talking about herself. She was speaking about the nature of authority, about how perception could distort truth, and how those in power often fail to recognize the true sources of strength around them. As the minutes passed and the immediate crisis began to fade, Thorne found himself reflecting on his own actions. The arrogance, the dismissal of Merritt's role on the ship. He had allowed his ego to cloud his judgment. He had underestimated her, just like everyone else. And now, he was left to pick up the pieces. "Director," Thorne began again, his tone now softer, more respectful. "What you did today, no one could have predicted it. But the truth is, we're lucky you were here." "I'm grateful." Merritt gave a small nod. "We all do what we can." The Admiral glanced at the crew, each one of them now realizing just how close they had come to a catastrophic failure. Without Merritt's intervention, the Aegis would have been sitting ducks, vulnerable to any number of threats, both internal and external. The implications of what had just happened were immense, and Thorne understood that he would have to reckon with them in the days to come. His pride, his command, it all felt like a distant memory now. As the last of the technical reports filtered in, Merritt took a step back, her task complete. But before she turned to leave, she paused and looked toward the crew. "The breach wasn't just an external threat," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the room. "It was an attempt to expose weaknesses. They're still out there, and we can't afford to be complacent." Her words were a stark reminder that the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The ship had survived today, but there were others who would try to exploit its vulnerabilities again. And Merritt Aldridge, who had once been a quiet observer, would be watching, waiting for the next moment when her unique set of skills would be needed. Admiral Thorne watched as she walked toward the exit, her posture as unassuming as ever. For a moment, he thought of stopping her, of offering more words, more gratitude. But in the end, he realized that it wasn't necessary. Merritt had done her job, and in the process, had reminded them all of the power that lies in the unseen, in the unnoticed, and in the invisible forces that shape the world around them. The USS Aegis had returned to its rhythm. The drills, the systems checks, and the mission preparations resumed. But something had fundamentally shifted aboard the ship. The crew had learned a hard truth. Authority could be found in the most unexpected places. Merritt Aldridge had slipped away quietly, as she always did. Her role, so carefully hidden, had been revealed at the most critical moment. But even now, after everything that had transpired, she was already fading back into the shadows. There were no grand speeches, no displays of triumph. She wasn't interested in recognition or acknowledgement. Her task had been to protect the ship, to ensure its survival, and that's exactly what she had done. The bridge was calm again, but the silence spoke volumes. Every officer, every crew member, had been forced to re-evaluate their assumptions. They had all assumed that leadership, strength, and power came in a particular form. A uniform, a rank, a loud voice. But Merritt had proven them wrong. She had shown them that true leadership wasn't about being seen. It was about being effective, decisive, and capable when it mattered most. Admiral Thorne had spent the days following the incident going over the mission logs, reviewing what had happened and trying to piece together how everything had gone so wrong. But as he sat in his quarters, staring at the reports, his mind kept returning to Merritt. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching the wrong person the entire time. He had been the one on the bridge, commanding the ship, issuing orders. Yet it was Merritt, the woman who had stood at the back of the room, blending into the background, who had saved them all. Her calm demeanor, her unassuming presence, had hidden the depth of her authority. She had never sought the spotlight. Instead, She had waited for the moment when her skills, her knowledge, and her power would be needed. And when that moment came, she had stepped in without hesitation, without drama, without fanfare. In the days that followed, the crew of the Aegis spoke of the events in hushed tones. In the officers' mess, the senior staff exchanged their thoughts, often with a quiet reverence for what Merritt had done. They spoke of the technical prowess she had displayed, but more than that, they spoke of the quiet authority that had been behind every action she had taken. She had given them a lesson in leadership, but it wasn't the kind of lesson that could be taught in a classroom. It was the kind of lesson that could only be learned through experience, the kind of lesson that changed the way you saw the world. Commander Afer, who had watched Merritt from the sidelines, reflected on her role in the operation. He had never questioned her authority before, but after the events on the bridge, he began to wonder how many others around him were also hiding their true capabilities. How many others were waiting in the shadows, watching, waiting for the moment when they would be needed. But there were also those who struggled with the aftermath. Lieutenant Commander Farrow, who had initially mocked Merritt, felt the sting of his earlier dismissiveness. His pride had been wounded, and he couldn't help but feel embarrassed by his earlier behavior. He had laughed at her, ignored her, and yet it was she who had saved the mission. He tried to tell himself it was just a mistake, a misunderstanding, but deep down, he knew he had underestimated someone who was far more powerful than he had ever imagined. The rest of the crew, too, found themselves looking at the world differently. They realized that authority didn't always have to be earned through loud commands or overt displays of power. Sometimes, the strongest people were the ones who went unnoticed, the ones who never sought the spotlight. Merritt had shown them that true strength was quiet, reserved, and often invisible until the moment it was needed most. But while the crew of the Aegis tried to make sense of what had happened, Merritt had already moved on. Her task on the ship had been completed, and now it was time for her to disappear once more. No one knew when she would leave or where she would go. She didn't need to say goodbye. It wasn't her style. Her presence had never been about her own needs. It had been about the mission, and now that the mission was complete, there was no reason for her to remain. For Merritt, her work had always been about protecting the ship, the people aboard it, and the greater mission of national security. She had been a shadow in their midst, and now that she had done what she came to do, she would return to that same shadow, unseen and unnoticed. She didn't need thanks or recognition. What mattered was that the Aegis was still operational, the breach had been contained, and the crew was safe. As the ship sailed back toward home port, the sun setting behind the Pacific horizon, Admiral Thorne found himself deep in thought. The operation had been a success, but it had come at a cost. He had learned a valuable lesson. Never underestimate the people around you, especially those who don't seek the spotlight. Merritt had shown him that true leadership was not about recognition or authority. It was about results. It was about quietly doing the work that needed to be done, even when no one was watching. When the Aegis finally docked, Thorne made a silent promise to himself. The next time he walked the bridge, he would remember Merritt Aldridge. He would remember the woman who had never asked for recognition, but had commanded respect when it mattered most. And so, as the crew disembarked and returned to their lives, the legend of Merritt Aldridge, the woman who had saved the ship, began to grow. Words spread among the officers, whispered in quiet conversations, told in hushed tones. To some, she was a myth, a figure of mystery who had appeared in their darkest hour. To others, she was the quiet guardian of the Aegis, a reminder that sometimes the strongest leaders are the ones who never seek the spotlight.